from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And our lineup today includes K-State's John Holman talking about the findings of a 5-year project which looked at occasional tillage for weed control in an otherwise no-till cropping system. Some very useful findings out of that work. John will tell us about them. K-State's Jeff Whitworth is standing by to report on several insects now making their move in row crops, including chinch bugs in corn and grain sorghum and Japanese beetles in corn and soybeans. He'll go over the control strategies for each. Today's Kansas Wheat Harvest Update features Extension Agricultural Agent Todd Schmidt of Greeley County, and K-State's Charlie Lee looks at the reproductive habitat of pronghorn antelope. All that right here on this Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today from Kansas State University. In our first segment, we'll draw more information from a very successful field day that took place in southwest Kansas recently, and the theme of this field day was tillage as compared to no-till systems, and there is a weed control component weaved into that, and we'll explain further. But one of those who participated in this field day is with us now via phone. John Holman is a research agronomist for K-State based in southwest Kansas out of Garden City. John, actually, before we get to the specifics that you passed along at this well-attended field day, K-State for several decades now has been running an ongoing comparison in research trials of tillage versus no-till, correct?
Correct, Eric. At the Tribune location, we have compared, like you said, for several decades now, no-till compared to conventional till, and then also a reduced till where tillage is only done in the fallow period, head of wheat in a wheat sorghum fallow rotation. And that study has clearly shown an advantage of no-till for particularly sorghum yields over that time period. Oftentimes sorghum yields yielding twice what the conventional till does due to increased water use efficiency of that in season of that sorghum crop. So in our moisture-limited environments, we know that there are advantages of no-till for crop yields and also for reducing soil erosion potential.
There's no doubt there's a value to no-till. However, there are complications, right?
Exactly. Yeah, right. Some of the challenges that producers have been facing is trying to get a wheat stand established in the fall. Oftentimes the ground is very dry, difficult to get a drill into the ground. The seed zone is very dry, so difficult to get a stand established. And so some producers have been looking at doing some tillage ahead of wheat in particular to try and help that wheat crop along. And then the other challenge that we've seen is managing difficult to control weeds. So back in 2013, we initiated what we are calling a strategic or occasional tillage system, comparing that to no-till, where we only work the soil once in that 3-year wheat sorghum fallow rotation, either right after the wheat harvest or in the fallow year ahead of wheat planting. And where we initially started that project was to manage some perennial grassy weeds that are difficult to control or practically impossible to control using any herbicides, and that being weed species such as red 3-on or windmill grass. And with a one-time tillage pass, we can effectively control those grass weed species. What we've seen since we started this project back in 2013, however, is we've seen a rapid increase in difficult weeds to control due to herbicide resistance, that being the kochia and palmer amaranth. And so we've had this study in place, and since that time we've seen growers reverting back to using tillage a lot more frequently to try and manage these very difficult to control weed species.
This one-pass tillage that has been employed, is it a somewhat light pass across the field? What?
Right, that's an excellent question. So what we are using is a very shallow one-time tillage operation to control the weed species, but that's all we're after, is to try and add another tool to our toolbox for managing those weed species. And so we use a sweep plow with pickers, and that has been very effective in helping to manage these weed species. And so we've been doing this at both Tribune and Garden City since 2013. So we have 4 years of wheat and grain sorghum data at both locations in this occasional tillage, one-time tillage, compared to no-till.
So the weed control component of this is favorable, but it always comes back to, are there any potential adverse effects on the productivity of those crops, either wheat or grain sorghum here?
Exactly. So we have seen an improvement in our weed control, and at the same time, surprisingly to us, across both two sites, 4 years, so 8 site years, we have yet to see a yield difference comparing the no-till and the occasional tillage. So for 4 years in a row now, we have not seen an adverse effect from a single one-time tillage. And as I mentioned earlier, we have clearly demonstrated and seen negative effects of more frequent tillage operations. So we know that if we till too much, we can reduce crop yields. And we will continue to monitor this type of system for several more years. But it looks like we can do an occasional tillage to help gain some improvement in weed control without negatively affecting crop yield.
What is interesting as a side note here, John, you've been conducting this research through some years that have been awfully spare on moisture out in your areas. So regardless of that, the crop performance has not waned, it appears, which says a lot, doesn't it?
It does. It does. We have had some very difficult, challenging years, and when weeds are drought stressed, that actually makes for controlling them a lot more difficult. And so this does look to be quite encouraging and promising that we can do some occasional tillage in the rotation and make, I think, for a more profitable and sustainable crop rotation, it appears. Like I said, we need to measure this for several more years, and we'll be doing some more in-depth analysis of soil properties. The other thing that we have done is we've added this year, in addition to these treatments, another tillage treatment where we will till twice in the 3-year rotation. We know that, as I mentioned, we know that if we till too much, we can see some negative effects, and so we're trying to find that tipping point where too much tillage is too much.
You brought it up right there, though. Soil properties are very much an essential part of this, and can you suggest to date that there's been any change in the soil quality, if you will, which is closely associated with no-till systems?
Well, we do not see any difference so far in the soil from looking at things such as bulk density that we've measured, or organic matter. So it does not appear that the one-time tillage operation in a 3-year rotation has any negative effects, but it takes a long time to see changes in soil properties, either positively or negatively. So we do need to measure this for a few more years to make sure that that's what we're seeing. Nonetheless, we have growers that are really running out of options in a true no-till system, and so I think that it appears that we can integrate some occasional tillage and still keep almost complete no-till system still working for producers. So we're very optimistic about this work. Obviously, the growers are very interested in this based on the feedback and the interest in the research we're doing, and so we think that we can make some positive recommendations.
And something else that you alluded to a moment ago, there is the economic part of this, and you have your partners in the Agricultural Economics Department putting numbers to the benefits of this approach in dollars and cents.
Yes, economists have been quantifying the profitability of these different systems and comparing the strategic tillage to no-till. We see those systems being just as profitable or more profitable than no-till. We're able to eliminate one herbicide application where it's being replaced by tillage, and we can also put some anhydrous down at that time and put down in a little bit cheaper form of nitrogen. The only other thing I might add is we've had some questions about a one-time tillage operation. Sometimes that leaves soil clods out there. Mm-hmm. So when you look at that maybe it doesn't look like a very good seed bed to plant into. But we found that if you do that tillage, 45 days ahead of when you plan to plant, we typically would receive, a significant enough rainfall that breaks those clods up, and we don't have any challenges then getting a good stand established in that system. The other thing having those big soil clods out there does for us is it helps prevent soil erosion. Mm-hmm. They're going to be less prone to blowing. So that's oftentimes a question we get, and we haven't seen that be a problem for us.
There are pluses all around with this work, and we're going to be anxious to see what more comes of this long-term research as you move it forward here in the years ahead. And if producers would like to know more about what you found out in this area, why, John, you avail yourself as well as others in K-State Research and Extension to address any questions they might have.
Absolutely. Yeah, producers can feel free to contact us, and we'd be happy to share our work with them.
Very well. Well, we appreciate the word on this. It's really garnered a fair bit of attention amongst no-till producers as a possible way of dealing with those challenging weed issues. John, we thank you for the summary, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Eric.
John Holman, research agronomist for K-State. He is stationed in Garden City, and he's been involved with this long-term look at occasional tillage as an option in a no-till crop production system. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. It's been a while since we've had an update on insects active in our row crops around Kansas, so we've welcomed back in crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth of K-State Research and Extension for a quick briefing here on a trio of pests which are prevalent in our row crops right now. The first of which we'll talk of, Jeff, we are very familiar with chinch bugs, and year upon year it seems to be a pest to varying extents, right?
Yes, that's exactly right, Eric. Probably 20 to 30 years ago, they were a problem about every 5 to 6 years. But in the last 10 years, it seems every year there are problems someplace throughout the state, at least in the north central to southeast, south central part of the state. I don't know why that is. I just know that it is. And this year is no different, even though I thought maybe with the warm May temperatures that we experienced, it might slow them down a little bit because they're like anything else. They don't like really hot, dry conditions. But it did not, and it slowed down the corn, so we've seen a lot of chinch bugs in corn. And one of the things I worry about is the corn, at least in that part of the state where it's been really hot and dry, has not developed as it normally does, as quickly as it normally does, and the chinch bugs are still developing. And a lot of the guys aren't looking down around the base of the plant where there's a lot of chinch bugs behind the leaf sheaths. And then as the sorghum starts to come on pretty good, there are pretty good populations in sorghum. And some of the growers have already treated sorghum with foliar sprays. The seed treatments, they work, but not well enough if there's a lot of chinch bugs coming out of wheat to protect the stand, although it will help. but they're just not sufficient to protect the stand. So the bottom line is there are a lot of chinch bugs right now, and a lot of guys aren't aware of it because they've been fighting the droughty conditions. But I think if we go throughout the rest of the summer and we continue to have hot, dry conditions, the chinch bug feeding, sucking the juice out of both sorghum and corn plants is going to take a toll on both crops.
And the telltale signs are in the foliage, really?
Yes, they're right behind the leaf sheath right now. Right now, in the last part of June, chinch bugs are mating. There's still a few nymphs, but the nymphs are maturing from the ones that came out of the weed a couple of weeks ago. And they're really tough to kill. Once that corn or sorghum gets to the B5, V6 stage, the vegetative stage with 6 or 7 leaves, the canopy of those leaves protect those chinch bugs pretty well because, again, they're down at the base of the plant. So if you do decide to treat, you need to treat here soon. Like I said, once it gets too big, it's going to be really tough because that spray is going to be intercepted. But you need to direct the nozzles, put drop nozzles on, direct the nozzles towards the base of the plant, and go along and spray with an insecticide that has chinch bug on the label. It won't kill them all, but it will actually does a pretty good job. If you don't do that, then hope we have good growing conditions. That will help a lot because, they're competing for the juice, for the moisture. And so if you have good growing conditions, at least the plants can tolerate more chinch bugs. Then in case of sorghum, once the sorghum starts to head out, those kernels start to develop, the bugs will crawl up the plant and they'll start feeding on that succulent tissue. If you can get out and check around the base of the plant in the corn and sorghum, if you have enough chinch bugs there, and a lot of times these are only going to be around the edge of the field, maybe the first 10 to 20 rows out into the field right now because they're laying eggs. But once this generation of eggs hatch and the new ones come on, they're going to spread out further into the field, and then they can fly, so they'll be flying around laying eggs. So right now is kind of the time, if you think you can or if you think you need to, get out and check your field, spray around 2 or 3 passes around the edge of the fields, especially the side that if there's any wheat bordering the field, put your nozzles down so that you have drop nozzles directed towards the base of the plant. Use enough gallonage to get everything soaked and get it wet. You can control those chinch bugs pretty well, not 100%, but still you can control them pretty well. But now's the time to do it, probably in the next week or so, while those eggs are being laid and then as those nymphs come on before they start doing much feeding.
Very well. You tell us that you're getting questions now from corn and soybean growers about the Japanese beetle in those crops?
Yes. Japanese beetles were first detected in Kansas in 1992, I believe. And ever since then, we've had a few infestations around the state. And in the last 5 or 6 years, they seem to be moving westward. It's the adult that causes the problem, and it's just as the corn is silking. If the corn's not silking, they're like corn rootworm adults. They'll feed on the leaves where they don't do that much damage. But if the ears are silking and the plants are tasseling, they will get up and feed on the silks. And if you got 4 or 5 on every silk, they can do a number holding the silks back and interrupt pollination. The nice thing about it, they're only going to feed probably for 7 to 10 days, and then they're going to go back, disperse, and go back to laying eggs. So I think they're just now moving to soybean fields if there aren't any corn fields nearby, where they'll feed on the vegetation, on the leaves. Again, they're not going to do that much damage if they're just defoliating a little bit. It's when they start feeding on the marketable product, i.e. if they start feeding on the corn or the silks in the corn, that they can cause a problem. Again, they're moving from one location into these fields, so mostly they're along the borders or along the edges. So before you get excited and go out to treat your whole field, get out and sample and make sure they're scattered throughout the field. There have been some fields, I've heard of 2 fields already treated this year. There are some products labeled for that. One of the problems with treating Japanese beetles, right now they're just emerging as adults, so you may spray today. Those silks may grow out a little bit, so the new silks that are there tomorrow or the next day won't have any insecticide on it. You get more Japanese beetles migrating in, feeding on those silks. It can be a real problem. So it's a matter of timing, but If they're not feeding on the silks right now, or the silks are brown, or the corn hasn't started silking yet, these beetles are only probably going to be active for about 7 more days, and then they're going to disperse, so you won't have to worry about them.
Right.
One of the other things is they're getting confused with the green June beetle,
which is very similar in appearance, but entirely different activity.
It does. It looks a lot like the Japanese beetle, only about twice the size of them. They're greenish or coppery green. The Japanese beetle is about half the size of a green June beetle. They're green, but they have little white tufts of hair on both sides, which makes them pretty distinctive. The green June beetle, they'll be in trees or bushes that are flowering usually this time of year because they're looking for nectar and pollen, and they're not an agricultural pest, but a lot of folks get excited because they think those are Japanese beetles, but it's a completely different species, and it's not a threat to agriculture, at least right now. I shouldn't say that because things change a lot from year to year, but right now they're just more of a cause for concern around bushes and trees. They're just going to feed a little bit, and then they're going to go away and lay eggs in the soil with very little problem.
So, again, be sure it's a Japanese beetle working on your corn and soybeans before you pull the trigger on any sort of control if necessary. And lastly, Jeff, grasshoppers are now ramping up in Kansas, not atypical for this time of the year.
Grasshoppers are, in my opinion, and have been, in my opinion, our number one agricultural pest across the state since we've had agriculture. They're here. They feed on grass. They feed on trees. They feed on just about anything.
And they're hard to control collectively.
And they can be difficult to control. But now's the time to do it. If you get out and you see the grasshoppers are just starting to move to corn, which they are, or soybeans, which they are, or preferably in the northern part of the state. If you get out now, they haven't moved yet. They're still in the weedy or grassy areas where the eggs hatched, and they're still little nymphs. Now's the time to treat. Get out and spray them while they're small before they spread out, because once they spread out, they're a little more difficult to control, and you have to spray a larger area. So the eggs are laid in grassy or non-disturbed areas, CRP, places like that, and that's where the nymphs come out from. And then as they feed and the grasses die down, or that normal host is eaten up or whatever, they'll spread out looking for more succulent tissue. And that's where we run into a problem with them when they get into sunflowers, corn, sorghum, whatever it is. They can do a number on them. Get out and look, and now's the time to treat, especially if you can just treat the weedy areas, or maybe just make 1 or 2 passes around the exterior of your field, the first few rows of soybeans or corn or whatever. One of the calls I've gotten, or a couple of the calls I've gotten lately, is about grasshopper baits. Mm-hmm. They've used different products to try and bait grasshoppers for probably 30 or 40 years now.
And some of these do, in fact, work, right?
They do work. They work really well if there's no other food source available for the grasshopper. But it's hard to compete with a nice, lush, green, succulent growing corn plant or soybean plant or any other kind of plant.
Strategize as you're controlling any of these pests in your row crops as we move forward throughout this growing season. And Jeff, undoubtedly something else will crop up, so to speak, in the not-too-distant future as far as insect pressure. So we'll have you back for a briefing at that time.
Very good. My pleasure. Thank you, Eric.
Glad to have you by, as always. Crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth, K-State Research and Extension, our guest on this part of Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to Agriculture Today on the K-State Radio Network. And as we move on now with another wheat harvest update, we're going to hear about wheat cutting so far in far west central Kansas, Greeley County to be exact, the Tribune area. The extension agent for Greeley County, Todd Schmidt, has joined us. Todd, before the harvest began, what was the thinking on the likely productivity of the crop in Greeley County? Because of the dryness over the winter and into the spring, was that in question?
Yes, it was. We've had an inch and a half of precipitation between October 1st and April 1st, and hopes were not high. That was definitely the case here in Greeley County. Guys kind of stuck with the wheat, though, and wasn't a whole lot of moisture to consider tearing it out and trying the spring crop. But guys have stuck with it, and we appreciate the recent rain that we've gotten.
So there was not that much acreage abandoned in Greeley County, you're saying?
No, not a whole lot. I mean, a few, I'd say less than 10%.
How much cutting has taken place so far, then?
Not much. We basically guys started test cutting about the middle of last week. And a few guys were getting to rolling towards the end of last week and then got shut down because of the rains. So we're expecting to kind of be in full go here come the middle of this week, and it won't take long to get us cut out.
Although the sample size isn't great, then what yields and test weights are you hearing from producers at the moment?
Test weights have been good, 59 to 61. Yields kind of vary, depends upon what part of the county you're in. Southwest part of the county and the west central part of the county, yields are going to be above average, I would say in the upper 30s to low 40 range. Other parts of the county where it was extremely dry, my guess is 10 to 20.
And that's all about where the rainfall took place, basically.
Yeah.
That's
rainfall and snow that we had, what little snow we had over the winter. It just kind of depends upon what part of the county it fell.
Are you tracking protein content at all? And if so, are you hearing some decent levels there?
Just a couple reports. I heard a report of 9 and a report up 11.5. So really not much to get a good guess on those yet.
And it may be a bit early to get a handle on what varieties are doing well amidst the substandard growing conditions out there this year. But do you have any names that pop to mind?
Bird's been looking really good. We had a lot of mosaic last year. Bird kind of stood out even through the mosaic. And again, this year, I think the bird really looks good. Winterhawk has looked good last year until it got hit late with mosaic. But several fields of Winterhawk still look pretty good. And still several guys using the old TAM 111, 112. That'll hang in there each and every year.
And you would anticipate, if the weather opens up like it's expected to finish harvest roughly when? How many days are left, do you think?
It'll be probably 2 weeks hard going here, and 10 days to 2 weeks, somewhere around there. We should be wrapping up.
Well, in comparing to 2017, at least perhaps the upside is you did not have wheat streak mosaic putting undue pressure on the crop like last year.
Yeah, exactly. We were blessed this year. It's a different year, and I was glad we were able to get some volunteer controlled and a few other things Mother Nature-wise went our way. So, yeah, the mosaic hasn't been an issue this year.
So your producers can take solace in the fact that at least it's been a relatively decent crop given how it looked going in, and you've received moisture to help your summer crops along, so maybe things are looking up, Todd.
Yep, things are definitely looking up. It's more positive around here the last couple of days than it was even a week ago, so yeah, things are good.
Very good. Hey, thanks for a couple of moments right here. Appreciate the input.
You bet. Anytime. Thank you, Eric.
The Extension Agricultural Agent in Greeley County, Todd Schmidt, speaking with us from his office in Tribune. Incidentally, in the USDA's weekly Kansas Crop Progress Report, as of this past Sunday, we find that the harvest is 52% complete statewide. That's ahead of the 44% pace last year, well ahead of the 32% for the 5-year average. Rounding out this segment, this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning feeding water to calves that are on a liquid diet. It's kind of interesting. There was a survey taken across the United States in 2014 that looked at some of our practices that we utilize in raising dairy calves. One of the more interesting observations from that survey was that dairy farmers typically wait many days before they start offering calves water. Yes, you are feeding a liquid diet, and you feed that diet 2 to 3 times a day, but calves still need water, basically from the first day of age. Will they drink a lot of water early on? No, probably not, but it still needs to be offered to them so that they start water intake at a very young age. If you're not offering water basically from a day of age, you really should consider doing that on your dairy farm. It is very important because water intake is needed to increase their dry matter intake. And increasing dry matter intake, particularly of the dry starter feed that you're offering, is very important to their calf growth rate. This later on will be very important to their milk production in their first lactation. And in some cases, we look at accelerated growth research that stimulates growth in the early part of the calf's life. That can result in an additional 1,500 pounds of milk during the first lactation. So water is a very cheap item that you can offer to your calves. So if you're not doing that basically from a day of age, you need to start doing that today. This is important during the summertime as well. One of the other issues that we sometimes run into on dairy farms during the summertime, particularly during the heat stress, is the fact that the calves may run out of water sometime during the day. Typically, animals are fed a liquid diet both morning and evening, and the water is refilled during that time. You may want to check those water buckets sometime around noon each day or 1 o'clock to see if they're still full. If they're empty, we may need to have a watering time during the middle of the day to make sure that they have adequate water throughout the whole day, and particularly in the afternoon when it's hotter. So again, I'd encourage you to take a walk down through the calf area in the middle of the day just to check to see if we have adequate water still available. If not, we may need to add another water feeding during that part of the day, at least while it's hot this summer. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to check on the calf water available in their calf area.
Thanks, Mike, and we'll return shortly here on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
This Agriculture Today concludes on another aspect of wildlife management. Joining us, as he does every Tuesday, Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. An update this week, Charlie, on pronghorn antelope, and they are found in Kansas. There is some history to those, and then we'll talk about a series of studies of antelope and predation. But what is their prominence to date in Kansas?
Well, we've probably always had a few pronghorn antelope in Kansas. They weren't completely extirpated. They're found in the western part of Kansas, basically in the western 2 to 3 tiers of counties, primarily south of Interstate 70. They've had a hunting season for pronghorn antelope in Kansas since 1974. Last year, approximately 200 antelope were harvested. The total population has been estimated around 2,000 pronghorn that reside in Kansas. Some folks think that's too many. Others, primarily hunters, think that that's not enough. So one way to try to increase wildlife populations is you try to reduce mortality factors. And when looking at the evidence and the research that's out there, one of the big mortality factors is coyote predation on fawns.
Expand on that. What is the magnitude of that predation? Pretty heavy?
It can be pretty significant, and it really relies on the type of habitat that is available, the vigilance of the female that's having the fawns, and then probably some of the hunting, trapping, pressure on the predators in the area. Vision and mobility are assumed to contribute to predator detection and avoidance for pronghorn antelope. And when pronghorn are found in open rangeland type conditions, you would think the habitat that is shorter and sparser would be the habitat that pronghorn antelope would prefer. They're fairly small. An adult pronghorn would probably be less than 40 inches in height, and other research has shown that if grass is more than 20 inches in height, it's not very suitable for pronghorn antelope. So when antelope are put into suboptimal habitat conditions, predator mortalities increase. So they try to mitigate for that by increasing vigilance. The female will scan the areas where predators may approach from more frequently, and when it's found in taller vegetation, they actually spend twice as much time scanning. That would be the scan duration, and they do those scans twice as frequently as they do in a habitat that is shorter. When you look at how much time does a pronghorn spend scanning for predators to try to avoid them, it's over 12% of their activity. That's a lot of energy expended trying to avoid predators. So another way to avoid predation is to use the proper bed sites for birthing. Again, that's associated with vegetation height and density, because the first 2 to 3 weeks of a pronghorn fawn's life is going to be lying in seclusion. So you need a certain vegetation height in order for that to serve as concealment cover for the pronghorn fawns. But then after that first 2 to 3 weeks, then the pronghorn fawns need to be able to see predators approaching so that they can run from them. So you have a couple of different types of habitat that need to be found in close proximity so that pronghorn fawns can be hidden for the first 2 to 3 weeks, and then shorter vegetation so that they can avoid predation by coyotes.
And again, coyotes are the number one predator on pronghorn antelope, and those have been the subject of a couple of research projects in support of antelope to potentially control coyote activity and therefore predation, right?
Yes, there's been a lot of studies that looked at the effects of predation on ungulates, including deer and pronghorn. A review of those showed about half of the studies indicating predation was a limiting factor, and not quite half said that it was not. But a large-scale removal of coyotes in Utah and Wyoming was conducted, where they removed coyotes from 400 square mile blocks, 6 blocks that had half of the block where they did not remove coyotes and the other half where the coyotes were removed. That certainly showed that pronghorn productivity, the fawn to adult female ratio, and the number of fawns was correlated with the number of coyotes that were removed and the amount of removal effort. So if you're going to remove coyotes from a large area, it looked like you could certainly improve pronghorn numbers. But I think we need to think carefully about the amount of effort that this would require. They were removing about 200 coyotes from 400 square miles. That's one coyote being removed from 2 square mile area. That seems to be quite different type habitat removal efforts than I think would be necessary in Kansas.
That's a pretty light density, isn't it?
Seems a very light density of coyotes, so I'm not sure that particular study is that applicable to Kansas, but it probably has some relevance as well.
There was another one, quickly we'll slip this in, out of Colorado that attempted to sterilize coyotes, again, to curb their predation on antelope?
Yeah, that study was done at Los Animas County, just east of Pueblo. They net-gunned coyotes and sterilized females with tubal ligation or vasectomy on the male coyotes. they had a 242% higher number of pronghorn fawns in the areas where the coyotes had been sterilized. So you can see either removing coyotes or sterilizing coyotes, at least in those two studies, showed a significant increase in the number of pronghorn fawns that survived.
Looking at all of this in full, then, if the objective is to enhance pronghorn antelope numbers and reduce predation on pronghorn antelope, it's going to take effort, isn't it?
It's going to be an effort that's going to be quite costly if you go to trying to remove coyotes. Probably habitat management is what we've always rely on in trying to manage pronghorn fawns.
There's some background on enhancing pronghorn antelope numbers and what it would take in a predation control sense to arrive at that. And Charlie, we appreciate it as always. Wildlife Specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension. Closing out our Tuesday edition. Thanks to you for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.